Ever since I was a kid, I loved watching movies, and no studio influenced my love of cinema as a child more than Pixar. Over the past month, I've made a YouTube short each day discussing my favorite scene in each Pixar film. So to cap off that series, and since I have all of the movies fresh in my memory, I figured I'd rank every Pixar film, including the recently released Toy Story 5. And when we get to that entry, I'll give a spoiler-free review. It's also worth mentioning that this ranking is going to be entirely subjective, which will almost immediately be abundantly clear. Considering just how many movies Pixar has released and the reputation some have earned, there's plenty of room for disagreement in any ranking. So with that being said, be sure to leave your own ranking in the comments. Well, we've got 31 films to talk about, so without further ado, let's get into the ranking. Alright, I already know people aren't going to like this pick, but something had to be in last place. Cars 2 fails as a sequel, in that it almost entirely ignores every theme present in its predecessor. It doesn't even accomplish what it is trying to do well. The very concept of a spy movie set in the Cars universe is ridiculous, which isn't helped by its poor execution. It took Pixar's least interesting world and inserted a TV movie level story and dialogue. Still, this being Pixar's worst film says a lot about the studio. Cars 2 isn't unwatchable by any means, and it certainly has its fans. I'm just not one of them. I hate Toy Story 4. Objectively, it should probably be closer to the middle of the list, but I'm not even going to attempt objectivity with this one. Toy Story 4 seems to have forgot what franchise it's even a part of. I guess Toy Story 3 was such an excellent conclusion that in order to keep it going, they had to ignore everything that came before. The characterization for everyone is off, but especially for Buzz and Woody, and the core themes that make Toy Story Toy Story are completely thrown out in its final moments. The only reason I'm willing to put this over Cars 2 is that through my disdain over the fact this movie even exists, I'm able to recognize that it is very technically impressive. Cars 3 only really ends up this low because of how disappointing it was to me. Is it an awful film? No. But it also wasn't at all what I think anyone else was expecting. In fact, the ending comes so out of nowhere that it almost feels like the concept and story came from two completely different people, which honestly might have been the case. I'd hesitate to say that the Cars franchise warranted a finale on the level of Toy Story 3, but at the very least, it deserved better than this. This should probably be ranked lower, but honestly, I found Lightyear somewhat entertaining. Don't get me wrong, it's pretty bad, but I also consider it to be inoffensive. It also didn't disappoint me quite as much as some of the other films mentioned previously. That being said, it is probably the worst movie I've mentioned thus far objectively. I think it starts strong and it ends pretty strong, but there's a solid hour or so in the middle that is just terrible. Also, that action sequence at the end in space is doing a lot of heavy lifting for its place in this ranking. I actually think that moment was pretty good. I just wish Lightyear went that big with its action sequences more often. I can't stress enough how subjective this ranking in particular is. If any of the aforementioned movies, or any of the few following this one are in your top 10, I'd probably think you're a bit crazy. But if Turning Red is in your top 10, that's honestly fair. Turning Red really just wasn't for me. I didn't relate to it at all, so none of the themes really had any impact on me. I also didn't find it very funny, but the humor clearly wasn't written with a large demographic in mind. At the end of the day, Turning Red is a film about a 13-year-old girl made for a similar demographic. While the consensus on Turning Red seems to lean further toward my current ranking of it, I wouldn't be surprised if it saw a significant critical reevaluation in the future. This one kinda hurts. I want to like The Good Dinosaur so badly. Unfortunately, it just isn't very good. It's boring, unfocused, and derivative. But the animation is really good, and I love the soundtrack. I think what hurts me the most with The Good Dinosaur is how much missed potential it has. I think one small change that would have massively improved this movie would be to change Arlo's design throughout the story. Maybe give him scars or have him grow a bit physically. To really make that work, you'd have to increase the length of his adventure though. Make it so that he's gone for maybe even a full year and we see him grow over that time. As it stands, The Good Dinosaur isn't terrible. It just should have been so much better than it is. A Bug's Life really is a victim of power creep. In case you're unfamiliar with the term, power creep refers to the introduction of a new thing that often makes the old thing obsolete or just unimpressive. Think of an anime like Dragon Ball, for example, where it starts with just martial arts and then Goku suddenly fighting whole armies, then aliens, then alien armies, and then the Emperor of the Universe. By the end of the show, villains from earlier in the series are no longer impressive. In a similar way, Pixar would go on to do just about everything A Bug's Life does well, even better in their future productions. From animation, humor, setting, emotion, characters, everything would eventually be surpassed by what Pixar would go on to release in the following decade. You could definitely argue that A Bug's Life deserves to be higher on this list, but I struggle to find a case for it that goes beyond nostalgia. When Incredibles 2 first came out, I hated it. I find the whole trope of men being incompetent fathers a bit tired at this point, and Bob somehow losing every bit of character development he got from the first movie like this is a Metroid game is ridiculous. That being said, Elastigirl is pretty cool, and the action sequences are some of the best in any American animated film. My opinion of Incredibles 2 getting better over time isn't me appreciating it on a deeper level or anything like that though. Rather, it's more so me not thinking about it too deeply and just appreciating it for what it is. Elemental was initially lower on my ranking, but I realized I wasn't really being fair to it. Elemental is a pretty solid film, just unremarkable. I don't think I'd be justified in placing it behind any of the films I've already mentioned, because it's really not bad or offensive in any way. It also contains some moments I actually like. Ember and Wade's dance in particular is a high point in the story, not to mention that the animation all throughout is very impressive. While I don't know much about animation on a technical level, I do know that both fire and water are usually difficult to animate, so I can't imagine how complicated this movie must have been. We've now arrived at the latest Pixar production, Toy Story 5. As promised, I will avoid spoilers. I actually enjoyed Toy Story 5. I especially liked how it didn't try to be some epic continuation of the franchise. More than anything, Toy Story 5 feels more like a spin-off or an epilogue. A good movie, just not as impactful as the other entries were. It really just sets out to answer some questions left from the earlier films and doesn't extend too far beyond that. The focus on technology was interesting, and it's a concept that I feel gave Toy Story 5 a leg to stand on. Maybe it plays it a little too safe, but after Toy Story 4, safe is what the franchise probably needed. Well, actually, what it needed was to end, but what's done is done. I've always had a weird relationship with Finding Dory. When it first came out, I didn't really like it at all. I saw it again a few years later and thought it was great, and now I think I've settled somewhere in the middle. Finding Dory is a worthwhile addition to Finding Nemo that actually does improve that story in retrospect. It still didn't need to exist though, and doesn't really do anything remarkable. I'd struggle to place it any higher, but I also couldn't justify placing it any lower. It kinda hurts to rank Luca so low, because I actually do have a very positive opinion of it. It's only this low because of its small scale, but there's a lot to like here. I thought the art style Pixar's been stuck to for a while actually works here, and I found Luca's lighthearted nature refreshing. It captures this sense of childlike innocence and whimsicality that really should be more of a focus in kids' movies. Beyond that though, Luca doesn't have much else going for it. Definitely a great kids' movie, but it doesn't really try to be anything more than that, which is absolutely okay. This entry will probably make a lot of people mad, but I too grew up with Cars. I watched it an absurd amount as a kid. But still, when I try to look at it objectively, it should probably be ranked even lower than this. It's very generic, and frankly, not that good. This is a subjective ranking though, and I really do love Cars. It's purely nostalgic bias, but that opening scene is one of my favorites in any movie I've ever watched. For me, obviously Cars ends up balancing out somewhere in the middle of my ranking, but this is one film I could see being some people's number one, and for others ranking in the high 20s. Since my generation is just now really weighing in on film discussion, Cars is probably at its peak in the zeitgeist at the moment. I think as my generation gets older though, the consensus on Cars will only continue to drop, but I'll always have an appreciation for it. I honestly have no idea what people think of Inside Out 2. The only news I've ever heard of it have been reports of its insane box office performance. I would have to assume that its place in this ranking is controversial though, considering just how well it did financially. I actually really like Inside Out 2, but I feel like Pixar probably should have gone a bit bigger for this sequel. When it's all said and done, I can't think of a single thing Inside Out 2 does better than the first one. Even the new things it did were largely unremarkable. For the most part though, it doesn't even try anything new. That being said, Inside Out 2 is still a great movie. But that's to be expected when it was copying the homework off of one of the greatest animated films of the 2010s. Hoppers was one of the biggest surprises to me on this list. I didn't expect it to end up this high, but I honestly love so much about it. One of the best aspects of Hoppers is the comedy. I loved the self-referential joke about the plot basically just being Avatar, which of course somewhat detracts from the movie since it isn't nearly as original as most of Pixar's works, but it was still a hilarious moment. I think that's probably what I liked most about Hoppers. It didn't take itself too seriously, but it also didn't shy away from having more emotional moments. I really liked Onward, which I didn't know would be a hot take until recently. People seem to really hate this one for seemingly no reason. I haven't seen a single criticism for it that goes beyond hating the celebrity voice actors, which I didn't have a problem with. I thought both Tom Holland and Chris Pratt did a fine job, and either way, Onward has much more going on for it beyond that. I thought the narrative was endearing, and the character dynamics had a remarkable level of nuance for a kids movie. Overall, I thought it was a fun adventure movie with great characters and an excellent ending. I really don't understand what's not to like about Onward, so I'm curious to see where it's commonly ranked in the comments. In my opinion, Elio is by far the most underrated Pixar movie. I don't even think that's a hot take, because from what I've seen, I think most people who have seen Elio really like it. The problem is that no one watched it, which is a shame because Elio at the time of its release was the best Pixar movie in the last 5 years. It's highly original, heartfelt, and funny. I will say though, I understand why no one watched Elio on release. Pixar really dropped the ball with marketing on this one. Not only was it barely marketed at all, but the trailers I did see weren't very good. In fact, I'd argue they were almost a highlight reel of the least remarkable moments of the film. I would highly recommend for anyone who likes Pixar films to check out Elio if they haven't already. This is the only movie on this list that I actually ended up watching multiple times for this ranking. I first watched it for the short, and my opinion didn't seem to change much from my previous viewing. Monsters University likely would have ended up ranking somewhere around 18 to 20, but for some reason I just felt I had to watch it again for this list, and I'm glad I did. Monsters University is honestly great. It's really funny first off, but what I most appreciate about it is how it uses its prequel status to mislead the viewer. Since we know Mike and Sully eventually become very successful, we assume we know how everything's going to play out. But the ending actually subverts expectations in a way that's both funny and makes sense in universe. Also, the soundtrack for this movie is so underrated. I think it's one of Pixar's best. I have a feeling this placement is too low for some, but once we get this high in the list, every choice is going to be contentious. I honestly think that the main thing working against Finding Nemo for me is how much I've watched it. The emotional moments really just aren't effective to me at all, which I can only assume is due to familiarity. That being said, I've seen some of the films ranked above it even more, and those haven't lost their impact at all. Still, Finding Nemo is a really fun adventure movie that is also incredibly quotable. Despite it not ranking that highly on my list, I still consider it to be a classic. I already know what people are going to say. Toy Story is legendary, it changed cinema, all that stuff. I know that. I love Toy Story as well. I just feel that its legacy is somewhat exaggerated. I feel that some of the praise the original Toy Story receives is given retroactively because Toy Story 2 and 3 were so great. So often I'll have a conversation where someone will say Toy Story is amazing, and then they go on to describe the plot of Toy Story 2. Again, I think Toy Story is a great movie, a classic even, but you have to admit that it hasn't aged perfectly. I feel like Pixar found a lot of stuff that worked with Toy Story, and will just go on to improve on this formula in much of their work from this point. It also doesn't help that the animation has aged especially poorly. Still, I'd never want to give off the impression that the original Toy Story is anything less than exceptional. I know how this looks. Ranking Brave above Toy Story might be considered blasphemous to some, but again, I want to stress the subjectivity of this ranking. I've always found Brave incredibly captivating. The animation and art style is among some of Pixar's best work in my opinion, and I'd love for the studio to go back to more stylized human characters in the future. As much as I love Brave though, I'll be the first to admit there was a lot of missed potential in its narrative. The bear stuff probably could have been cut down a bit, but that doesn't change the fact that the movie both begins and ends perfectly. There's only that slight lull in the middle. If Brave ranks way lower on your own list, I completely understand, but it's always been one of my favorites. To start off the top 10, we have a new age Pixar film, which was a shock to me as well. Few Pixar productions have been as emotionally resonant to me personally as Soul though. I found it to be both beautiful and relatable. In particular, that scene of Joe playing the piano in his apartment was incredibly moving. I really wish Soul had gotten a traditional theatrical release, because I promise you the consensus opinion of Soul would be much higher if that were the case. It would undoubtedly be mentioned in the same breath as Pixar's other classics. As is though, I believe Soul to be one of Pixar's more underrated works. Up is the definition of a Pixar classic. It's creative, funny, heartfelt, and it's become iconic. The opening montage alone is one of the greatest things Pixar has ever produced, but the rest of the film isn't without merit. It's a fun adventure with many powerful moments throughout. Also, it's worth mentioning Up's amazing soundtrack. That iconic main theme that plays during the opening is profoundly moving, and is a big reason why Up is as memorable as it is. It conveys the sentiments the film is trying to get across in a way only music could. Up would be most studios' best production, but for Pixar, it only ranks 9th on my list. I'm just now realizing that I've grouped together 3 of Pete Docter's 4 films here to start off the top 10, which is absolutely a testament to his consistency as a director. He consistently tells emotionally resonant and entertaining stories, and Monsters Incorporated is no different. I will say though that Monsters Incorporated is by far the funniest of his productions. There's a reason it's been as pervasive as it is within meme culture over the years, and speaking of memes, it's also worth mentioning the music in this film. That main theme in particular is great. On top of that, it also tells a heartfelt narrative, and that ending is unforgettable. Coming in at number 7, I've got Toy Story 2. Toy Story 2 has one of the most insane production stories I've ever heard. And honestly, I'm surprised the film released at all considering the conditions it was made under. Not only did it release though, but it's almost universally considered to be one of Pixar's best projects. As I mentioned previously, I feel that a large part of the praise given to the original Toy Story really belongs to this movie. Toy Story 2 was so good that it retroactively improved the consensus opinion on the original Toy Story, a movie that already was almost immediately recognized as a classic. If that's not a testament to Toy Story 2's quality, I don't know what is. For Pete Docter's final appearance on this list, we have 2015's Inside Out. While I did enjoy Inside Out too, realistically, it was never going to top this film. One of the things Pixar does best is how they create these incredibly unique worlds for most of their films. The way they mapped out the human mind in such an interesting yet easy to follow way is fascinating. Not to mention how relatable the story it tells is. Inside Out could have coasted along on the novelty of its concept alone, but Pixar managed to actually execute on it, and in my opinion, created a masterpiece. When I first set out to make this ranking, I thought the top 5 was completely locked up. And while the top 4 actually didn't end up changing, Coco managed to sneak in at number 5. I love Coco. In my opinion, this is the most emotionally resonant Pixar film to date. I don't often cry while watching movies, but Coco is the only movie on this list where I actually did cry on my initial viewing. Of course, that was during the scene where Miguel sings to Coco close to the end of the film. It's such a powerful moment that for one reason or another hit me harder than any other in Pixar's filmography. All of this not to mention the great music and amazing visuals in Coco, which firmly establish it as both a Pixar classic and a masterpiece. Not much I can say about WALL-E that hasn't already been said. It's one of Pixar's most critically acclaimed movies, and that's for good reason. It tells a poignant story focusing on romance and environmentalism that is not easily forgotten. Ever since I was a kid, I've been a fan of sci-fi as well, and I definitely owe that in part to WALL-E. Its narrative and characters are just so endearing. It also has incredible visuals and music. Some sequences, like WALL-E and Eve's dance in space in particular, are just mesmerizing and powerful. By all possible definitions, I'd consider WALL-E to be a masterpiece as well. We've now reached the top 3, and I'll preface this by saying that the top 3 are constantly rotating for me. There is no solid pick for number 1. I'd consider each one of these 3 to be among some of the greatest films I've ever seen, and I've rewatched each an absurd amount. With that being said, for today I've decided to place Toy Story 3 in 3rd place. As the grand finale to 2 of the most acclaimed animated films ever made, there were high expectations for Toy Story 3, and it not only exceeded those expectations, it even surpassed its predecessors as well. Toy Story 3 leans heavily into the themes that made this series so great, and simultaneously gives the narrative the highest stakes the characters would ever see. This is the definition of a perfect conclusion to a trilogy, and a perfect sequel. Just as a sequel, by that criteria, I think Toy Story 3 belongs in the conversation as one of the greatest movies ever made. And in totality, I believe it placed the Toy Story trilogy in the conversation as one of the greatest trilogies ever made as well. In 2nd place, I've got Ratatouille. This might sound stupid, but I think of all the films I've mentioned today, Ratatouille has had the most profound impact on my life. That core message of just chasing your dreams regardless of what people say, or even what you yourself may think at times, really resonated with me as a kid, and stuck with me down to today. This whole YouTube thing was a dream of mine within itself, and while I haven't accomplished everything I want to do with it, the fact that I'm even here in the first place talking about my favorite Pixar movies is unbelievable. I've never had much interest in cooking. Quite frankly, I'm terrible at it. But that message of anyone can cook translates to so much more. In essence, it means that anyone, regardless of origin, can accomplish whatever it is they set out to do, so long as they have a true love and passion for it. And the role that idea has played in my life has been irreplaceable. Finally, in first place, the film I would call the greatest Pixar production to date, The Incredibles. I grew up with this movie, so call it nostalgic bias or whatever you like, but I love The Incredibles. It's a fun, action-packed adventure that'll entertain kids, but its more mature themes also ensure that the narrative grows with its audience. Throughout my teenage years, I'd come back to this film several times and consistently get more and more out of it. Really, the reason this movie is above all others, though, is because of a few particular memories I have with it. I'm not going to sit here and act like I have some tragic backstory or a rough childhood, but when times did get tough, for one reason or another, I'd always go back to The Incredibles. I have a certain memory from my childhood where I had watched The Incredibles, as I often did, and didn't think much of it. A few days later, some major event in my life transpired, and for whatever reason, I decided to watch The Incredibles again. And I distinctly remember this strange feeling, as if my eyes had been opened for the first time in my life. I was around 8 years old at the time, and all of a sudden, it felt like I was seeing things as I never had before. Not just hearing words, but actually listening. Not just seeing people, but picking up on nuances in their expressions. Now I want to clarify that what I was experiencing was nothing special. The answer for this strange feeling was pretty simple once I was able to understand it. I was just growing up. But since I had The Incredibles as this measuring stick, I had this almost tangible representation of that fact. To discover that such depth was hiding in plain sight all this time, at such a young age, is likely what inspired my desire to peer into films deeper than most ever do. To try and get all I can out of a story and understand things like author's intent. Of course, I don't mean to say that The Incredibles is some profoundly deep work of fiction, but rather that to 8-year-old me, it was a gateway into such things. I've always been a fan of animation. Unfortunately, in the larger film community, some of these movies tend to get written off as just kids' movies and not actual cinema. And in some respects, I can understand that assessment. However, I would implore anyone who holds such an opinion to watch both the top 6 films I mentioned today, along with the Toy Story trilogy. They are among some of the best the world of animation has to offer. And if that doesn't convince you that animation as a medium has serious power beyond what it's given credit for, I don't think anything will. Thank you to everyone who made it this far, and please be sure to leave your own ranking in the comments. Of course, I don't expect most to have seen all 31 of these movies, so if your list is incomplete, that's just fine. And I seriously want to thank all the regular viewers of this channel. You guys are the reason I get to do this, and I'm extremely grateful for that. I have so much more coming in the future, so please stay tuned for that as well. And as always, thanks for watching.